My name is Margaret, and this story begins on the day I buried my husband, Robert. The church was quiet, filled only with the low hum of the organ. People sat with heavy faces, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest. I sat in the front row, dressed in a simple black gown I had chosen with care. It wasn't flashy or loud, but I believed it carried dignity and respect for the man I had loved for over 3 decades. I thought grief would be my hardest battle that morning, but I was wrong. In that sacred moment, when hearts should have been united in mourning, I became the target of ridicule. My daughter-in-law, Rebecca, broke the stillness with words that cut deeper than she could ever imagine. She mocked my dress. She laughed at the woman she thought was too poor, too tasteless, too small for the occasion. Her voice carried, and I felt dozens of eyes shift toward me. My son Daniel squirmed in discomfort, unable to stop her. Even her friends leaned in, nodding, as if cruelty was entertainment. I sat there quietly, hands folded, head bowed. To those around me, it must have looked like weakness. But silence, for me, has always been a choice, because what Rebecca never knew, and what no one in that chapel could have guessed, was that the dress she dismissed so casually was not cheap at all. It was a custom design valued at $8,000. Each pearl button alone cost more than what most people spend on an entire outfit. And the greatest irony of all, Rebecca worked for the very fashion house I founded, and I was the one who signed her paycheck every single month. That day, she thought she humiliated me. In truth, she wrote the first line of her own downfall. And as I walked out of that chapel with her laughter still echoing in my ears, I already knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The chapel should have been a place of reverence that morning. A final farewell to the man who had been my anchor for so many years. Instead, it became a stage for humiliation. As Rebecca's voice echoed through the pews, I could feel every eye shift in my direction. I remember staring down at my hands folded tightly in my lap, my knuckles white from holding on so firmly. I told myself to breathe, to stay still, to let the storm pass. But it didn't pass. She kept going, louder this time, almost feeding off the uneasy silence in the room. I could sense Daniel, my son, shifting uncomfortably beside her. But he didn't step in. He looked trapped between loyalty to his wife and respect for me. And my daughter, Emily, sat on the other side of me, her hand brushing against mine in a quiet gesture of comfort, her eyes silently begging me not to let Rebecca's words pierce my spirit. Inside, though, I was torn apart. Not because I cared about what she said. I knew the value of the dress on my body. I knew the years of sacrifice, of late nights and early mornings, of stitches and sketches that had gone into building the fashion house that created it. What cut deep was not her insult to the fabric, but her eagerness to tear down another woman at her lowest point, in the middle of grief. I felt anger well up in me, not only for myself, but for Robert, who would have hated to see his widow treated with such disdain. He had always told me that funerals reveal the true heart of people, and that morning, Rebecca revealed hers to everyone present. She didn't just mock me, she mocked the memory of the man we were there to honor. I let her words wash over me without response. To those sitting behind me, it may have looked like I was weak, like I was too timid to stand up for myself. But in that silence, I was making a choice, because sometimes silence carries more weight than shouting ever could. What no one in that chapel knew, and what Rebecca herself could never have guessed, was the irony of her mockery. She thought she was exposing my lack of taste, when in reality she was revealing her own ignorance. The gown she ridiculed so easily was worth $8,000, each mother-of-pearl button alone valued at $500. The shoes she dismissed as cheap imitations had been crafted by hand at a price of $12,000. And the woman she scorned as a failure was the very person whose signature appeared on her monthly paycheck. I could have spoken up. I could have humiliated her right there, in front of the entire congregation. But I didn't. Because revenge shouted in anger is fleeting, and I wanted something more lasting. I wanted her to learn the lesson Robert had always whispered to me: never confuse kindness with weakness. When the service ended, I rose slowly, keeping my head high, even as I could still hear her laughter behind me. People offered their condolences, and I accepted them with quiet grace. Daniel avoided my eyes, and Emily looked like she was ready to explode on my behalf, but I said nothing. I walked to my modest car, a 2014 Toyota, and drove back to my small apartment. To the world, it looked like that was all I had, and for years, I let them believe it, but I knew better. I knew that behind my modest life, a secret waited, one that would change everything. And it was time, finally, to let that truth come to light. When I reached my apartment that evening, the quiet pressed down on me. The walls felt smaller than usual, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to sink into the grief of losing Robert. I slipped off my shoes, the same $12,000 pumps Rebecca had sneered at, and placed them gently back into their box. To her, they were nothing more than flea market finds. To me, they carried not just value, but years of craft, care, and pride. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, the one Robert and I had shared countless meals at. His voice still echoed in my heart, steady and gentle, telling me not to let kindness be mistaken for weakness. He had repeated that lesson so many times over the years, almost as if he knew I would need to hold on to it when he was gone. That night, I realized silence alone would not be enough. Rebecca had crossed a line that could not be ignored, not because of her words about fabric or money, but because she had trampled on the very principle Robert and I had built our lives on: respect. In the corner of my living room stood an old oak bookshelf, worn from decades of use. To most visitors, it looked like nothing more than a place for dusty novels and family photo albums. But behind one row of hardcovers was a latch. When I pressed it, the shelf swung open, revealing a hidden doorway. Inside was my private study. The air smelled faintly of cedar and leather, a mix of age and memory. This was the part of my life almost no one knew existed, not even Daniel or Emily. The walls were lined with framed photographs of moments that had defined my journey: the ribbon cutting at our first boutique, sketches of early collections, contracts signed late at night, Robert's proud smile beside me in every milestone. On the mahogany desk rested fabric swatches, old ledgers, and files that told the story of a lifetime's work. Robert and I had started with nothing more than a rented stall at a flea market, selling handmade scarves. We worked through nights where we couldn't afford to heat the store, days when one missed payment could have ended everything. Slowly, with grit and perseverance, that stall turned into 17 luxury boutiques and 3 textile factories across the country. Yet, despite all of it, the millions in contracts, the properties tucked away in trusts, the recognition from designers who now looked to me for guidance, I had chosen to live modestly. I drove a 2014 Toyota when I could have driven a Bentley. I lived in a small apartment when I could have bought any mansion I wanted. People assumed it was because I lacked wealth. In truth, it was because I valued perspective. I wanted Daniel and Emily to know what it meant to live without entitlement. I wanted them to understand humility before they inherited privilege. Rebecca had no idea. She saw only the surface, and she judged me for it. She never once stopped to think that appearances can be deceiving. That night, sitting in my secret study with the echoes of the funeral still haunting me, I knew it was time. Time to remind her and everyone else what Robert and I had always believed: real power doesn't need to shout. And so, I made a decision. The next step was not about anger. It was about timing, patience, and a lesson Rebecca needed to learn, one she would never forget. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards. The morning after the funeral, I sat in my study, staring at the old photographs that lined the walls. For years, I had kept this part of my life hidden, but now it felt like Robert was urging me to act. His words echoed in my heart. Kindness is not weakness, and I realized the time had come to show Rebecca exactly what that meant. I picked up the phone that very few people knew I even owned, the one reserved for business matters only. I asked my assistant to quietly pull Rebecca's file, not out of spite, but because I needed to see the truth laid bare, without the mask she wore in front of my family. What came back did not surprise me. I learned of her tardiness, of complaints from clients who felt dismissed by her attitude, of supervisors noting how she carried herself as though she were above the very customers she was supposed to serve. None of it shocked me, but seeing it in writing gave me clarity. And then came the deeper truth. The financial records told a story of debt credit cards maxed at over $4,000, a car loan of $22,000, and an application for a mortgage on a house worth $4 million. That far exceeded what their combined salaries could ever sustain. They were living beyond their means, building an image of luxury on borrowed time and borrowed money. Robert used to call that hollow living. He believed appearances built on debt were like sandcastles waiting for the tide. Now, I was watching Rebecca's tide roll in, and she didn't even see it coming. It struck me then, the irony. She had mocked me for living simply, for driving an old car and staying in a modest apartment. But it was my simplicity that kept me free, while her show of wealth was nothing more than shackles she had fastened on herself. I sat back in my chair and thought about timing. Anger demanded I confront her immediately, but wisdom told me to wait. I didn't want an argument. I wanted a lesson, one she could never forget. So I chose patience. I let the reports rest in a folder on my desk, and I began to plan. I knew the moment would come, and when it did, I would not need to raise my voice. The truth alone would be enough, because the truth has a way of stripping away illusions, and I was ready for Rebecca to see herself without the mask she clung to so tightly. And soon, the stage would be set for that confrontation. By Friday morning, I knew the time had come. I dressed plainly, in a gray cardigan and worn flats, carrying a handbag so understated no one would have guessed its worth. To anyone passing by, I looked like an ordinary customer walking into the flagship store downtown. That was exactly the image I wanted. The boutique gleamed under soft lights, polished marble floors reflecting every step. Associates greeted clients warmly, moving with grace and attentiveness. All except one. Rebecca leaned against the counter, her phone pressed to her ear, her laughter far too loud for the setting. A woman with silver hair stood nearby, waiting patiently. But Rebecca ignored her, rolling her eyes as if serving her was beneath her. I stayed quiet, observing. She bragged openly about her upcoming promotion, certain she was about to climb higher in the company. I almost pitied her then, but pity was not the lesson she needed. When she finally noticed me, her smile was practiced, the kind she gave customers she believed didn't belong. She reminded me that the store was expensive, as if I might embarrass myself by browsing. I nodded politely, still saying nothing. Every gesture, every careless word she spoke confirmed what I already knew. She didn't just treat me poorly. She treated anyone she judged unworthy with the same disdain. And then, the moment arrived. My assistant, Clara, walked into the store with a folder in her hand. She approached me calmly and addressed me by my formal name, asking if I was ready for the managers upstairs. The air shifted instantly. Rebecca's face drained of color. Confusion spread across her features. And then fear. She realized who I truly was. I straightened my shoulders and told her the truth. I was not just her mother-in-law. I was the founder and owner of the company she worked for. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of associates stopping in their tracks, shocked by the revelation. Clara opened the folder and began to list the incidents: the ignored clients, the late arrivals, the hours spent on personal calls. I watched Rebecca tremble, her confidence stripped away in front of her peers. She stammered, trying to explain herself, but I cut through her excuses with calm finality. What mattered was not whether she knew who I was, but how she treated people when she thought no one of importance was watching. I told her that respect is not a privilege reserved for the wealthy or powerful. It is the foundation of human decency. She had failed that test, not just with me, but with countless others. Her career ended in the very place she once believed she would rule. And as I turned to leave, I knew this was only the beginning of the truth that still needed to be revealed, this time, within my own family. After the confrontation at the store, I knew there was one more truth that needed to be faced, not in public, but within the walls of my own home. Daniel had defended Rebecca for too long, not knowing the full scope of her actions or the life she had chosen to hide from him. It was time he understood the reality. I asked him to come by the next afternoon. When he stepped into my apartment, he looked weary, as if the weight of the past week had aged him. I led him to the old oak bookshelf and pressed the hidden latch. His eyes widened as the door swung open, revealing the study he never knew existed. For years, I had kept this part of myself tucked away. Now, I opened it fully to him. He walked slowly around the room, his gaze falling on the photographs of our first boutique opening. The contracts signed in those early days. The files showing the growth of what had become a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He turned to me, stunned, realizing for the first time that his mother was not the modest widow he thought she was, but the architect of the very company where his wife had just been exposed. I placed a folder in his hands, the same one containing the reports about Rebecca, her behavior, her debts, the way she had mocked me at Robert's funeral. He sank into a chair, silent, as the truth settled over him. I didn't tell him what choice to make. Instead, I reminded him that the kind of man he became would depend on how he responded to the truth now laid before him. That day, Daniel's world shifted, and soon, Emily too would come to understand why I had kept our fortune hidden for so long. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Daniel began working at the boutique as a floor associate, starting from the bottom, just as I had. I saw him greet each customer with patience, and one afternoon he shared with me how a widow had come in, nervous and unsure. and how he treated her with dignity. She left with only a simple scarf, yet he said it was the most meaningful sale he had ever made. In that moment, I knew he finally understood. As for me, I often found myself remembering Robert's words, "Kindness is not weakness." They had carried me through grief, through humiliation, and now into a season of healing. And that is what I want to leave with you. Respect is priceless. True strength is found in humility. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to like, share, and leave your thoughts below.